Woo. Trying to find my way, 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 trying to find my way. I'm trying, change me.
My faith is in God alone, beyond a reasonable doubt. This brainstorm pouring rain on your season of drought. Just trying to lay a couple seeds in the mouth. Thanks for listening. You ever get the feeling you was missing?
What up, y'all? It's your hometown hero, Scott Lane, the Black Bruce Wayne, a.k.a. the real Adam Coleman. So, you riding with Tru-ID. Where y'all been, man? Well, really, where have I been? Where you been, Scott? A lot of people asking me that question. Man, I've been all over the place, man. You know, I know that it's been a couple weeks since I dropped the episode, and man, it's just been crazy, man. I can't even lie to you. I really underestimated, how big of a change it was going to be just having our newborn. You know, shout out to my wife Candace and our new baby boy Caden. You know, shout out to them. But yeah, I guess the thing is, man, like. I was a father of two already. You know, my son, our newborn was born in April, and I thought I had like a handle on this whole, fatherhood thing. You know what I mean? I've been through one, pregnancy, and then the second one, our son comes along, our older son. And then, this third one, I'm like, okay, cool. I got the hang of it or whatever, I just kind of, I'm doing my thing or whatever. And it's just like the transition from going to like 2 kids to 3 is real. It's like you go from being like a dad to all of a sudden like you're just running a daycare. You know what I mean? When you hit that 3 kid mark, it's like it's no joke. And I totally underestimated how much it was gonna change my schedule. So it kind of threw me off in terms of like editing shows and recording new episodes and stuff like that. But I think I'm getting my legs under me. As time is going on here. So, getting back to business, man, getting back to, putting some episodes out. So, I thank everybody for, the patience and all that kind of stuff. And we're going to keep it rolling, man. So, just like I said, man, just, been doing a lot of things, still been, out there doing apologetics related stuff. Let me just kind of give you a rundown, let you know what I've been doing here. So, while I'm away, what have I been doing here? Well, actually, I've been on a couple, different shows as a guest, actually, which has been pretty cool because I've been used to, doing the host thing. So, I had the opportunity to, be a guest on a couple shows. Actually, I did host a Google chat with the Shield crew, my man Vocab, Malone, and them. We did an interview with a pretty interesting guy, man. He's a gospel rapper, goes by the name of Chrys Jones. Y'all should definitely check him out. Spelled Chrys Jones. And y'all should definitely check him out, man. He's got some bars, man. He did a song regarding the Hebrew Israelites. It's a pretty powerful song, man. Pretty powerful song. He's talking about, well, as a matter of fact, what I'm going to do is I'm not going to tell you about it. I'm actually just going to play that song at the end of the show, so y'all can kind of hear this guy's testimony a little bit. But yeah, did an interview with him, did another show with my man, Faithful to God. Shout out to him and the whole Soldiers of God crew. Had a blast doing that, man. Definitely want to have him on the show. As a matter of fact, he's like the expert. When it comes to the breakdowns of the Hebrew Israelite doctrine and all that kind of stuff. Then on top of that, man, we'll get to it in a minute. But I was also on a pretty cool show called Talk with the Titans, which is very well known conscious community show. So we'll get back to that in a second. We kind of dig into that a little bit. But yeah, man, just been staying active, man. Writing articles. Had to bang out a couple articles. And actually, matter of fact, for all the things I'm mentioning here, I'm going to put in the description of this episode, I'm going to put the different links to the different things I've been up to, so y'all can click on it. Watch the the interviews that I've been a part of, and click on the links for the articles I've been writing. I wrote one about maybe I guess about a month and a half ago, maybe a month or so ago, called "Black Lives Don't Matter." So that's going to be interesting. But that's actually the first article that I've written that I posted in certain forums, even Christian forums, and it was removed, surprisingly. So, different people's, reaction to that. So, definitely check out the hashtag Black Lives Don't Matter article, and you can see what I'm talking about there. I can almost guarantee you there's probably not what you think. But anyway, I also wrote another article about a week or so ago called Lebronogetics, try to fuse the worlds of basketball and apologetics a little bit, so wrote that. You can definitely peep that. Like I said, I'll put the link in the description. And I got I don't know if it's out yet or not, but I wrote 2 articles for the King Movement as well, kingmovement.com. And I sent those out. So I'm not sure if they're out yet or not, but you can definitely just kind of, I guess, be on the lookout for a couple articles I got dropping there. Speaking of King Movement, this past weekend, man, had the opportunity to went down to Raleigh, North Carolina, where we had the an official ceremony where I became an official member of the King Movement. Anybody who's been following the show recalls that I had Chrys from Fox Sports 1. He's got a ministry called the King Movement that I highly recommend. And I had the opportunity to go through the process, the ceremony of becoming an official member. So I'm literally a card-carrying member of the King Movement now, man. So I'm definitely excited about that. Shout out to all my King Movement people out there, man. I had a blast, man. Chilling with all the guys. Obviously, Chrys was there. Shout out to True Pettigrew. Shout out to just all the guys that was there, man. Had a blast, eating burgers, talking sports, and all that kind of stuff. Definitely excited about getting involved with them. So it was just down in Raleigh last week, and like like I said, man, I just got to been all over the place, man. And somehow in between all that, had the opportunity to go see Guardians of the Galaxy 2 and Wonder Woman. So definitely some dope movies. I'm a comic book guy, man. So I, even in the midst of doing this and that, had to get my comic book movies in. But yeah, man, just been on the go, man. Just been on the go, adjusting to the new baby. Trying to put out some material, some articles and stuff like that. And, just being guests on different shows, just been on the run, man. So, like I mentioned a second ago, I had the opportunity to go on a very popular YouTube show called Talk with the Titans, hosted by a brother named Kalam L. I'm pretty sure that it's either the most well-known or certainly among the most well-known shows in the UK as far as the conscious community is concerned. So I had the opportunity to be a guest on there. The opportunity presented itself, so I hopped on it. And man, just interestingly, Christians aren't always welcome in some of these conscious community circles, but the host Kalam is very gracious, man. I had a blast. We covered the topic: is Christianity the white man's religion? So definitely want to check out that. It's probably about maybe an hour and a half, something like that. And I cover I want to say 4 major points. I actually had 5 major points prepared, but I couldn't get to all of them. But definitely covered, 4 solid points there. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to put that link as well in the description section of this episode here, and also the bibliography that I used. And so, for anybody want to kind of check some sources and just want to study up on the type of things that we cover here at Tru-ID. You can check that bibliography link. You kind of see what I'm reading out there. So, definitely that. So with that being said, man, like I said, I just kind of been on the run, man. Had a lot of things going on. Definitely staying active with Apologetics. I got some speaking engagements coming up that I'm very excited about. Shout out to my man, Dwayne Atkinson from the bar. We definitely going to be sliding down to South Carolina to get it in with them, man. And, just do some stuff there. A presentation. Shout out to my people at the No Ceilings, in Richmond, VA. Definitely looking forward to getting back out there with you guys in July, man. So I'm just excited, man. God's doing some great things. He's definitely opened up some doors, man, that I just kind of just still mind blowing, man. It really is. And I'm just really excited about it. And just, man. So with that said, I wanted to kind of touch on a few things. Like I mentioned, I did the presentation, Is Christianity the White Man's Religion, on the Talk with the Titans show. So I thought I might do just as kind of maybe take a snippet of that, take one of the 4 major points that I covered and just kind of give you guys a taste of what I've been up to, and the type of information that we've been putting out there, man. So we definitely want to dig into that. But before I do, you know, there's been a lot of things going on here, man. Over the last, since I released my last episode, obviously, given the nature of my show, man, I talk about race a lot. I talk about race, quite a bit, obviously. And there's just so much going on in our society right now, man, when it comes to just that racial issue. I mean, it just keeps on brewing, and it's just getting ugly out there. It's getting ugly out there. Obviously, from the last time I dropped the show till now, I mean, we had the Philando Castile verdict. We had the Officer Slager who murdered Walter Scott. We had that mistrial, and then whatever happened there legally. I mean, shoot, man, we had the Southern Baptist Convention. I guess the SBC with their whole thing with debating about white supremacy, and there's just so many things going on, man. It's really hard to keep track of it. And I kind of want to open it up to you guys, man. I want to give an open invitation because I want to have some discussions about these things. I want to have some panel discussions where we talk about race, because I think it's just really important that that Christians be able to think through these things in a biblical and logical and compassionate way. I just feel like so many times we're just, talking past each other and just not really, seeing eye to eye. And it's not to say that, just by talking about things, we're all going to agree. I mean, I recognize that. But I do think that some fair, honest, and just, I guess, I don't know, just fair and honest discussion. I just really think that it's necessary. And maybe, we'll get into that, but I just want to open it up. I want to give people my email for anybody out there, listening, who might be interested in, being on a panel, to discuss these things. We'll probably get together like a Google Hangout chat or something like that, and just maybe do like a series of discussions where we just kind of, allow people to, speak their mind and, control the situation and, really talk these things through. So hit me up if you're interested. Hit me up, man, at Tru-ID7@gmail.com. That's TRUID, the number 7, at gmail.com. All right, I want to give people an opportunity to kind of come on and just talk these things through. And actually, what I'm going to do is, because people ask me all the time, my views on these sorts of things, and I've purposely, not really dug into it too much on this show as of yet. Partly because, just to be completely honest, I mean, I'm transitioning in terms of some of my own views. I really try to be, open-minded and, Bible-minded, about some of the things, just about the things that I believe, the convictions that I hold. And I think that just the racial baggage that we see in society, it's just so endemic to, this Western world. I really want to be careful about how I approach it. So therefore, I just haven't really, ventured into it too much. But yeah, it's kind of like a side project I have, where I'm really just trying to think through these things in a biblical way. And so anyway, what I think I'm going to do is actually I'm going to go ahead and just, maybe whether it be next episode or within a few episodes, I'm just going to kind of maybe give you guys my thoughts, kind of just how I think through these things, and just, open it up for a discussion, see what you guys think. And, hopefully by then we'll have some people volunteer to, come on the show and really hash these things out, So yeah, so like I said, if anybody's interested out there in terms of, coming on the show and, just discussing, these, this the race issue that we're facing today, and, hopefully maybe getting to the bottom of some things. Yeah, definitely, hit me up at Tru-ID, that's TRUID, the number 7, at gmail.com, So there you have it. So, so back to this presentation. Like I said, I was on Talk with the Titans the other day. Had the opportunity to just had a blast, man. Had a great time discussing the question: is Christianity the white man's religion? So, like I said in the description of this episode, I'm gonna go ahead and put the link to that so you can see it in its entirety. But I just want to kind of give you guys a little snippet of that, man. There's some things we were talking about there. I had a lot of things in my notes, that I wasn't able to cover in that presentation due to just kind of time constraints. So I'm going to kind of give you guys the somewhat unabridged version. Basically, I'm going to kind of play a narrator to myself and read the script of the things that I presented, and then I'm going to kind of throw in some nuggets here and there, some stuff that I wasn't able to fit into that the interview. I covered a lot of things in that interview, man. I mean, we started out. I talked about Christianity in Africa. I mean, obviously, man, there's 2,000 years of Christianity on the continent of Africa, with about 1,500 of that coming before the transatlantic slave trade. A lot of people don't want to talk about that because it doesn't fit their narrative. But we talked about that. We talked about Christianity as it relates to the slavery era, transatlantic slave trade, and that era there, what was going on then. We talked about the genetic fallacy. We dug into a little bit of philosophy there. We talked about the gospel, man. We talked about the evidence for the resurrection. For anybody who's been following along, my man Cameron Bertuzzi killed it. Giving us just that evidence for the resurrection, man. And so I incorporated a lot of that into into my presentation as well, and basically just talking about if Jesus really rose from the dead, what are the implications of that? As it relates to this conscious community stuff, and just having that sense of identity and all that sort of a thing. So I really tried to connect the dots, for folks right there. So definitely check out that interview, man. And like I said, just because of time constraints, I wasn't able to get to everything, because I actually had a whole section prepared for to discuss slavery in the Bible. Definitely had some notes on that. So I think I'm going to go ahead and turn that into another episode as well. But today I'm going to go back to that Christianity during the slavery era, right? I'm just going to kind of basically read through, my notes on that. I pretty much have a transcript of my presentation, so I'm going to read that for you guys, and just kind of give you, some of the extra pieces that I wasn't able to fit in there. And when it comes to Christianity during the transatlantic slave trade, I refer to that as the hard question. All right. It's not to say it's really all that hard. I mean, if you really do the research, but there's just so much information available. I mean, just readily available about Christianity in Africa before the transatlantic slave trade. I mean, man, it's for anybody who believes Christianity is the white man's religion, because they're under the delusion that that black people didn't know anything about Christianity before the transatlantic slave trade. I mean, it's just silly. You can always. Like I talked about in the presentation, hopefully you guys will check it out. But man, you got churches, that have been excavated in Ethiopia that date back 1,500 years, right? You have just so many different African theologians, from the earliest centuries of the church. We're talking about Augustine, we're talking about Tertullian, we're talking about Cyprian, we're talking about Athanasius, Bishop Alexander, we're talking about Abba Anthony. We're talking about Abba Moses, also known as Moses the Black or Moses the Ethiopian. There's just so many people I could throw. I could just keep on going. Bishop Demetrius. We could talk about Origen. We could talk about, who's my man? It's just so many different people, right? Theologians, martyrs, like, Perpetua and Felicitas, and the group of Africans that were martyred for the faith. Written about in Tertullian's writings and elsewhere. It's just so many different people, man. Just Africans in early church history that played just pivotal roles in the growth of the church and just church history at large. So, aside from that, you got Christianity spreading through Egypt before the close of the first century. By the 3rd and 4th century, you got Christianity in what's today Tunisia, Libya, Aksum, Ethiopia, going on down to what we call today Sudan. Back then, we're talking about ancient Nubia there, which was a Christian nation from about 450 A.D. to about 1400 A.D. Christianity being practiced there, man. So it's there's just a load of history. It's just a ridiculous amount of history in Africa, of Christianity before the transatlantic slave trade. So to me, I consider that to be the easy question. I mean, it's there. When it comes to Christianity during the slavery era, that was a little bit tougher. Because, obviously we have a group of people, the African slaves who were deprived of a voice. They were deprived of the autonomy, to be able to go and do and say what they wanted to go and do and say. And so therefore, our evidence concerning what they believed and what they did, is obviously somewhat muted, I guess, from the historical record, so to speak. So you have to do a little bit of digging there, But what I've done is over the last maybe 2.5 years, I've spent most of my time, kind of digging into that era, because I think that even when you cover Christianity in Africa, inevitably people are going to say, well, yeah, that was East Africa, or that was North Africa. What about the West Africans? Or, they'll talk about, of course, they'll go back to slavery. Man, that's kind of like the linchpin of, most of these arguments. When people say Christianity is the white man's religion, 9 times out of 10, they're gonna go back to slavery and the supposed indoctrination of Africans into Christianity during that time. And so that to me is I call that the hard question, because that's kind of like where everybody's go-to is going to be. So a couple of years ago, I started out just trying to compile a list of arguments to kind of refute that sort of a thinking, that type of objection to Christianity. I started out at first with maybe about 5 or 10 arguments. Now I'm up to about 30 now of arguments that contend against this idea that Christianity is the white man's religion, and most of it being historical and philosophical refutations that center around Western slavery, that era. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to kind of read part of my presentation where I basically combine some of those different arguments in a way that I think is easy for people to digest. And then hopefully you guys can see where I'm coming from. One thing you'll find is that I like to emphasize hearing our ancestors in their own words. Because the vast majority of us have never read a slave narrative. It's sad to say, but it's true. I mean, I didn't until a couple of years ago. I didn't even realize that we had scores of slave narratives just that have been preserved up until today. Where we can read, them in their own words about, what they thought and what they experienced. It's just something that for whatever reason has been under the radar. But so I like to use a lot of quotes and things like that to kind of illustrate the points that I'm making. So anyway, yeah, like I said, let's go ahead and I'm just going to kind of read through, kind of go audio book mode, Scott Lane audio book mode, and kind of read through my presentation and just kind of add things, a little commentary here and there. So modern slavery and Christianity. And by modern slavery, I'm referring to the transatlantic slave era, slavery here in the West, what have you. And I'm going to start with kind of like my thesis statement here, and then we'll just kind of flow through the evidence. All right. Okay. So here we go. The belief that Christianity is the white man's religion is largely based upon an incomplete assessment of the historical evidence available to us today. As we'll see in a moment, having a correct understanding of slave religion, quote unquote, is a matter of upholding the dignity of our forefathers, I think. Now, when I first began looking into this issue for myself, I thought I had a pretty good idea of how Africans experienced Christianity during the slave era. If any of you are like me, there's this idea of the angry white man, angry white slave master with a Bible in one hand and a bullwhip in the other, beating Christianity into the African slaves, kind of like that classic scene from Roots where Kunta Kinte gets beaten into taking on the name Toby. I mean, I pretty much just figured that's how it went down, in terms of how African slaves became Christian, like end of story. But then as I was reading through a collection of slave narratives, slaves conveying their experiences in their own words, I came across a passage that really shocked me. And I want to share with you guys, all right? These are the words from former slave John Brown, who is describing what Sundays were like on the plantation where he was. He talks about how it was pretty much a light work day. Then everybody would gather at the slave master's house for the church meeting. And I just want you guys to really key in on what he says here. Okay, this is the words of John Brown. All right, quote: Master John's wife would start the meeting with a prayer, and then would come the singing, the old timey songs. But the white folks on the next plantation would beat their slaves for trying to do like we did. No praying there and no singing. End quote. Now, this really struck me right here as odd at first because, again, my understanding was that the slave masters used Christianity as a means to control the slaves, keep them in their place, and just basically beat it into them and so on. But John Brown is reporting about how slave masters were actively keeping their slaves from practicing Christianity. This was the first time that the light bulb really turned on for me. It occurred to me that there were a diversity of ways in which slaves came in contact with or experienced Christianity, not just the one scenario that I was familiar with. There was much more to the story than I'd realized. Now, let's explore that a little bit. All right. I think most people out there who are like me, they formed their ideas about Christianity during the slavery times based upon that single Kunta Kinte scenario that I described. But you see, that's just one piece of the puzzle. Actually, I think when it comes to history, the idea of history being like a puzzle is very helpful. Just like with a real puzzle, the more pieces you have in place, the better you can see what the picture is. With history, the more facts you have to work with, the better we can interpret what was going on in the past. Now, like I said before, I'm not really here to make excuses for the church, far from it. What I want to do is look at 5 facts of history concerning Christianity during slavery, add those facts to our puzzle, and then see where that leads us in terms of our picture of what was going on back then. All right, so fact number 1. A significant number of slave owners actively opposed the preaching of the gospel to their slaves. Now, I hear a lot of folks today asking the question, why did our oppressors give us the Bible? Or something, to that effect. And I think an equally valid question is, why is it that for significant portions of the slave era, the slave masters actively prevent Christianity from being given to the slaves? In her article entitled "The Ultimate Sin, Christianizing Slaves in Barbados in the 17th Century," Dr. Catherine Gerber puts it this way, quote: "The slave owners' initial confusion about the consequences of slave conversion is representative of a more general confusion about the repercussions of Christianity on slavery in the Protestant Atlantic world. Slave owners did not know whether they would be forced to free or eventually manumit their slaves if the latter were converted to Christianity. Some were also concerned that Christianity would give slaves dangerous ideas about freedom and allow them to become too similar to their Christian masters." End quote. Now, it was very reasonable for them to think that slaves, being freed on the basis of them becoming Christians was a possibility, because at that time, according to English common law, it was illegal to own someone who was a Christian. Actually, among the Dutch, you have some settlements in the mid 1600s that did free African slaves who got baptized. Aside from that, throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, there were a number of legal cases in which African slaves attempted to use this to their advantage and petition for their freedom on the basis of them having been baptized. In the U.S., we see examples of these sorts of cases in Felix petition to a Massachusetts court in 1773, Peter Bestis petition for freedom in 1773, petition made by a number of Africans to Judge Thomas Gage in 1774, and others as well. Now, I want you to listen to an excerpt from the petition made to Thomas Gage in 1773, and I want you to really key in on the argumentation here. This is a slave who's petitioning for their freedom on the basis of their Christian convictions. So, quote from this petition: "By our deplorable situation, we are rendered incapable of showing our obedience to Almighty God. How can a slave perform the duties of a husband to a wife or parent to his child? How can a husband leave master and work and cleave to his wife? How can the wife submit themselves to their husbands in all things? How can a child obey their parents in all things? End quote. Now, what the petitioner here is doing is showing how the conditions of slavery do not allow for the enslaved person to fulfill what God requires of us all. And the implication is therefore slavery itself is against God's moral law. Therefore, on the basis of God's law, the judge should grant freedom to the petitioner. So, what we see here again is the petitioner is identifying as a Christian and on that basis contending for his freedom by appealing to Christian principles. You see, this is a principal reason why many slave owners stood firmly against Christianity being preached to the slaves. They saw slaves as property and didn't want to lose that so-called property due to an African slave becoming a Christian. That's why in the early 1700s or so, you see laws being passed, right here, like where I live in Virginia, but throughout the colonies that specifically tried to end this legal debate about baptism being grounds to be for slaves to be free. They were also well aware of the elements of Christianity that promoted liberty and equality among all people of all races. And obviously the slave masters didn't want Africans to get any ideas about that either. Therefore, as I said, they were actively opposing the preaching of the gospel to the slaves. Now, what's interesting is, a lot of people, I'm just going to kind of, I don't know if I said this in the presentation or not, but this is like an aside. But what I found on the internet, a lot of people are posting this book by a gentleman named Charles Colcock. And he's a reverend, basically, and I probably get the title wrong, but he wrote a book called How to Make Negro Slave a Christian, or How to Make a Negro a Christian or something like that. And, usually people will post that and and just like, oh, wow, look at this. This is what happened. We were enslaved and they made us Christians. And I suspect most people haven't actually read that book. I have that book on my computer right now. I've actually, if you read it, if you actually read the book, you'll see why he wrote it. I think it's, I wish I had the reference right in front of me, but I think it's on like page 14 or so. Charles Colcock talks about how slave masters were actively opposing ministers coming in and preaching to the slaves for the very reasons that I've listed so far, is that, they didn't want to have to set their slaves free from, being baptized, and they didn't want their slaves getting, like uppity or something like that, and so for these, various different reasons, slave masters actually, Charles Colcock says, I want to say it's on page 14, that slave masters themselves were the primary obstacle to Africans receiving the gospel. So it's just something very interesting to consider there. Now I'm not trying to say that there was never a case where slave masters were trying to indoctrinate the slaves. I mean, obviously that happened. I'm not trying to say that Charles Colcock was some great virtuous dude. Not saying that at all. Again, my point here is that you don't have like this neat cookie cutter scenario where all slaves, all Africans, came to know Christ under the same conditions. That's just not historically true. So anyway, just moving on. Fact number 2. There is substantial evidence of slaves practicing Christianity on their own terms. In his book entitled Slave Religion, The Invisible Institution, Dr. Albert Rabateau explains how African slaves were able to make a distinction between hypocritical slave owner Christianity and authentic Christianity. In great detail, Dr. Rabateau describes how this understanding among the slaves about their slave masters practicing a false version of Christianity prompted the slaves to practice Christianity independently and hidden from their slave owners. Slaves would steal away at night, deep into the woods, where they would gather and hold their own prayer meetings and worship services. If slaves were caught by patrollers while having these prayer meetings, they would be severely punished. I mean, we have evidence, through slave narratives where it's talked about how a slave, quote unquote, slave preacher was beaten for preaching the gospel, and having these prayer meetings, and how, slaves who were attending these meetings would be forced to, basically snitch on others who were attending these meetings, and this sort of thing. So, just really at the risk of their own safety, they would, again, steal into the woods and, into what they call hush harbors, and to have these secretive, prayer circles and things of that nature, and worship services. So again, getting caught was just not an option. So in order to make sure that they weren't heard during the night worship sessions, the slaves would do things like fill a basin with water, and whoever was praying or encouraging the others would speak into it and muffle the sound. I mean, this is just deep. This is really deep. I'm just really picturing that. In one slave narrative, it's reported that they would create an enclosed area by hanging up wet blankets around them, again to muffle the sound. The slave narrative that I read on that is just really profound. That the gentleman who talked about that referred to this this wet blanket enclosure as being like their tabernacle. He actually used that term. It's very, very powerful stuff. Very interesting. As a matter of fact, let's go ahead and get some quotes in here, man. Let me scroll down here to get some actual quotes from some slave narratives. So you guys can hear what I'm talking about. Let's start with Lucretia Alexander. Lucretia Alexander, former slave, in her own words, quote, "The slaves didn't go to the church building. The preacher came and preached to them in their quarters. He would just say, 'Serve your masters, don't steal your master's turkey, don't steal your master's chickens, don't steal your master's hogs, don't steal your master's meat. Do whatever the master tells you to do.' Same old thing all the time. My father would have church in the dwelling houses, and they had to whisper. Sometimes they would have church at his house. That would be when they wanted a real meeting with some real preaching." Very interesting. Let me give you another one. This is a quote from W.L. Bost. All right, W.L. Bost, another former slave. Quote, "Us slaves never had a chance to go to Sunday school and church. The white folks feared for slaves to get any religion and education. But I reckon something inside us just told us about God and that there was a better place hereafter. We would sneak off and have a prayer meeting. Sometimes the patrollers would catch us and beat us good, but that didn't keep us from trying." End quote. Actually, I just found that line so interesting, man. He said that I reckon something inside just told us about God and that there was a better place hereafter. It just really sounds like that sensus divinitatis, for my Reformed epistemology friends out there. Just something kind of interesting to think about. So again, this was a very active, informal system of Christianity, which existed independently from, and in many ways was counter to, the slave master's version of Christianity. Very interesting stuff here. Fact number 3. For many slaves, conversion to Christianity was in itself a form of personal resistance against the system of slavery. Now, we have to really grasp the mindset that was floating around Europe during the period in which slavery was in full swing. Dr. Audrey Smedley really lays this out in her work, and I've included it in the notes that I gave you guys. If you just click on that link in the description for my bibliography. But in order to justify enslaving Africans, you had the intellectual elites of that era buying into the belief that Africans were literally less than human, didn't have souls, or maybe at best, were childlike subhumans that needed more developed races to take care of them for their own good. They had this paternalism type deal going on. Okay. Just the very personhood and human dignity that we all share was just denied, to the Africans. However, though, as these ideas were being imposed upon Africans through not only physical slavery, but also the ideological oppression behind it, Christian conversion provided Africans with an escape hatch, so to speak, from the mentality that they were lesser beings. In a sense, converting to Christianity was like a personhood equalizer, all right? And that slaves found their worth, dignity, and personhood in God, an authority much higher than their oppressors. I found this really good quote, man. One of my favorite scholars over the last couple of years has been Dr. Albert Rabbitoe. He's kind of like the Julius Irving of scholars who dealt with Christianity during the slave era. I just really benefited from a lot of his works. I just want to read you guys a portion of his book. It's actually in the introduction. It's called "God Struck Me Dead" is the name of the book. And it's just a bunch of slave narratives about their conversion experience. It's really powerful stuff. And so in the introduction, he has this quote here. I just think it's so awesome. Just definitely want you guys to check it out. Quote, for the slaves facing the dehumanizing conditions of enslavement, the daily physical, psychological, and emotional attacks against their dignity as persons, to experience the total acceptance and affirmation of themselves by God contradicted at a fundamental level the force of the very system bent on denigrating their humanity. In the conversion experience, slaves realized it in the heart, not just the head, that they were of infinite value as children of God, chosen from eternity to be saved. Amidst a system bent on reducing them to an inferior status, the experience of conversion rooted deep within the slave convert's psyche a sense of personal value and individual importance that helped to ground their identity in the unimpeachable authority of Almighty God. End quote. That's my homie there, man, Dr. Albert Rabbitoe. It'd be dope to have him on the show, man. That'd be tough. But yeah, man, so just even reading that, man, as I was kind of preparing for the presentation, it really brought me back to actually my personal favorite slave narrative, which is Josiah Henson. Reverend Josiah Henson, I should say. And it's just so powerful, man. I'm going to include his a link to, you can go online and read his autobiography as well. And I just want to kind of just share a couple things from his life, man, because he talks about pretty much what Dr. Rabbitoe lays out, just the potency of the conversion experience. And my favorite part of his biography is actually kind of towards the end, where he's an escaped slave, or former slave, I should say, and he'd been living free for at least 50 years or so. And from the time that he escaped from slavery, he made it up to Canada, and he ended up going overseas for a period of time to England, and just became a very well-known speaker and abolitionist. And he comes back to the States. He wants to comes back to Maryland, where he's from, because he wants to show his wife, the plantation that he grew up on. Somewhere in that trip, you got a chance to have an audience with the president and all that kind of thing. It's just really powerful story. And so he goes back to the plantation where he's from, and he really paints this picture, man. It's just very interesting of just how it was all the plantation that he grew up on was just so vibrant and full of just activity. And then as he returns, it's just dilapidated, just run down, overgrown with just random, brush and that kind of a thing. And he's just kind of describing it all, man. So he goes to visit, and he's looking for his former slave owner. And it just so happened that the slave owner had passed, but the wife, was still alive. And so he goes in there, he's goes to see the his former slave master's wife or whatever, and she doesn't recognize him. And she's very sickly, she's bedridden, just in really bad shape. She doesn't even recognize him when he walks in. And it's powerful, because apparently he'd had some scarring on his arms that were just very notable. His arms had been shattered at some point. And so as the wife couldn't recognize who he was, he allowed her to touch his arm so she could, so she could identify him. And, in doing so, she finally realizes that, who Josiah Henson is, this, her former slave, who had escaped from her and her husband. And her what she says is, she exclaims, she says, "Oh, Cy." She called him Cy for short, I guess short for Josiah. She says, "It is Cy. Oh, it is Cy." And then she says, "Your master is dead and gone." And it's just so powerful, because Josiah Henson then replies to her, "No, madam, my master is alive." He's referring to Jesus Christ. And it's just like, I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not a soft dude, nothing like that, man. But, the first time I read that, I can't even lie, man. I got misty eyed, man. I mean, because it's just such a powerful expression of the gospel. Powerful expression of the gospel. I mean, it's just, you have a living example, recorded there of what Dr. Rabbitoe, which I just read to you guys, was talking about. Just how, in that simple statement, it was just this idea of how belonging to God, having your affirmation in him, your worth in him, it was a way of saying, to the slave master, to that system, you might have my body, but you can't have my soul. Man, it's just powerful, man. Powerful. Just in giving themselves over to the lordship of Jesus Christ, the slaves found liberty from their earthly master through submission to the one who's master of us all. It's just deep. It's just deep. So, and actually what's interesting about that, because, chapters earlier, again, like I said, that part where he comes back to the plantation, all that's kind of towards the end of his story. But several chapters before, he talks about how he came to Christ. And it's so interesting, man. Like I keep going back to how, most of us have like this idea, like that one scenario of, kind of Kunta Kinte getting the Bible beat into him. That's kind of how we imagine, all slaves, came to, or just all black people in America came to, know the gospel. And what's interesting is, as Josiah Henson, if you look in his autobiography, he's telling his story, and he says he actually had never heard a sermon or even just a religious conversation up until he was age 18. Very interesting. He mentions other than from his mom, little things, I guess, here and there about a supreme being or whatever. And he just talks about, he never heard a sermon. And actually, as he's telling the story about how he, came to Christ, he talks about how his slave master at the time was really just kind of begrudgingly let him go, just didn't want him to go hear this preacher, a gentleman by the name of Mr. McKinney, apparently. And it just, it's interesting. He kind of mentions, somewhat in passing how, Mr. McKinney, the preacher that was the first person that he ever heard preach, was well known for, being somebody who just detested, slavery, just hated slavery. And even though he was a white man at the time, refused to accept slave labor for anything. Like even, let's say if a nearby slave owner wanted to contract out, one of their slaves to Mr. McKinney, he just wouldn't, get down with it. He was just totally against it. And he just kind of mentioned that in passing, which is very interesting. But now he mentions a scripture here. I'm just going to go ahead and read it right quick before we get into Josiah Henson's own words about his conversion. Because he mentions it, so I just kind of want you guys to know the scripture he's referring to. He talks about Hebrews chapter 2, verse 9, which states, "But we see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels for the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, that he, by the grace of God, should taste death for every man." Very interesting. Okay, so let's get to Josiah Henson talking about his conversion here. So, quote, he said, "This was Hebrews 2:9, the first text of the Bible to which I had ever listened, knowing it to be such. I have never forgotten it, and scarcely a day has passed by since in which I have not recalled it, and the sermon that was preached from it. The divine character of Jesus Christ, his tender love for mankind, his forgiving spirit, his compassion for the outcast and despised, his cruel crucifixion and glorious ascension were all depicted, and some of the points were dwelt upon with great power. Great, at least to me, who then heard these things for the first time in my life. Again and again did the preacher reiterate the words, 'for every man.' These glad tidings, this salvation, were not for the benefit of the select few only. They were for the slave as well as for the master, the poor as well as the rich, for the persecuted, the distressed, the heavy laden, the captive, even for me, among the rest, a poor, despised, abused creature, deemed by others fit for nothing but unrequited toil, but mental and bodily degradation. Oh, the blessedness and sweetness of feeling that I was loved. I would have died that moment with joy. And I kept repeating to myself, the compassionate Savior, about whom I have heard, loves me. He looks down in compassion from heaven on me. He died to save my soul, and he'll welcome me to the skies. I was transported with just delicious joy. I seemed to see a glorious being in a cloud of splendor, smiling down from on high. In sharp contrast with the experience I had felt of the contempt and brutality of my earthly master, I basked, as it were, in the benign smiles of this heavenly being. I thought, he'll be my dear refuge. He'll wipe away all the tears from my eyes. Now I can bear all things. Nothing will seem hard after this. I felt sure that if Master Riley only knew him, he would not live such a coarse, wicked, cruel life. Swallowed up in the beauty of divine love, I loved my enemies and prayed for them that did despitefully use and entreat me. End quote. Man, that's just powerful. I don't even want to add anything onto that. That's the words of former slave, escaped slave, Josiah Henson. And like I said, I'm going to post that a link to his autobiography so you guys can check it for yourselves. But man, it's just such a powerful story, man. Such a powerful story, and just an expression of the gospel, the freeing power of the gospel. It's just deep. So anyway, yeah. So point number 4. Just keep rolling. Point number 4. Christianity provided a framework for the public resistance of slavery. Okay. When I speak of public resistance here, I'm primarily thinking about the abolitionist movement, but there are other directions I could go with this as well. I mean, even going back to the 1800s, you've got black evangelical churches organizing boycotts of slave-produced products, being politically active, and working against the ideas of the time that black people were of lesser stock than whites. But even as far as abolitionists go, I mean, there's just so many people that we could talk about. And I mean, we got Frederick Douglass, a lot of Equiano, Autobiography, William Wilberforce, William Lloyd Garrison, Henry Highland Garnett, my man John Rock, Jermaine Wesley Le Guin, the Grimke sisters. We could talk about Martin Delaney. We could talk about, I mean, there's just a whole host of names, man. A whole host of names when we talk about the abolitionist movement. And we can see from their writings, from their speeches, these folks, that their Christian convictions were a basis of them opposing the slavery of their time. There's just no question about it. I mean, when you look at their speeching and the writings, and you find in their argumentation against slavery just littered with references to scripture and or just biblical concepts which they employed in their efforts to fight against slavery. I actually have a quote here that I quoted in that presentation. Let me scroll down to it. Yeah, here we go. So this is from Jermaine Wesley Le Guin, clergyman and abolitionist. This was during a speech that he made in 1850 in response to the fugitive slave law. The fugitive slave law basically said that if you escape to the north, obviously from the south, then you could be recaptured and brought back. That's basically, I guess in simple terms what that was all about. And so, Jermaine Le Guin is responding to that. Just listen to what he says here. He just really exemplifies this relation between Christianity and anti-slavery activism. Quote, he says, "I owe my freedom to the God who made me and who stirred me to claim it against all other beings in God's universe. I received my freedom from heaven, and with it came the command to defend my title to it." End quote. It's just really powerful, man. Just when you think about how, Jermaine Le Guin took it to be like a God-ordained moral duty to fight for freedom. I mean, that's just deep. And man, we could even talk about Henry Highland Garnett, who goes further than that. He writes a whole speech encouraging the 3 million or so slaves in the South to rebel and revolt. Henry Highland Garnett was so radical, in terms of being militant for that sort of upheaval that he wasn't even accepted among some of the abolitionist circle. I mean, he was a wild boy, but definitely was down for the cause, man. Just this idea of, passive, weak Christianity during the slavery era. Man, you just definitely can't use that cookie cutter perspective and then really grapple with the things that Henry Highland Garnett and others like him were saying at the time. So it's just so interesting, man. Like, people talk about, Christianity in the Bible was used to keep us enslaved, so don't be a Christian, right? And, like I said in the presentation, I could take the same logic and say, well, Christianity in the Bible was used to fight against slavery, so you should become a Christian. Now, of course, in either case, in either of those positions, it would be illogical for, to say that, because, whether Christianity was misused to promote slavery or used to fight against slavery, the more important question is, are the claims of Christianity true? That's the most important question. And then we can kind of, work through the other things. But that's another subject for another day. Last point here, man. Fact number 5. All right. Slave songs and folk tales from that time depict the God of the Bible as a God of liberation, not oppression. Now, you notice I mentioned folk tales right here. I didn't get a chance to get into this in the presentation, but this is something I'm actually going to have to commit some more study to. But, there were folk tales during the slave era, where you have these Christian themes, and you see, slaves kind of passing along this idea that God is a God of liberty and was on their side, through some of these folk tales. Like there's one I want to say is called Praying John, where you have this slave who was supposedly, just really committed to God and praying fervently and all these types of things. And there, some situation happened to where the slave owner was angry with him and wanted to shoot him, but because he was so right with God, the gun barrel jammed. And the slave master just had to walk away angrily and wasn't able to kill Praying John. Now, apparently this was, maybe it was based on some type of true story, but it was essentially a folk tale that was passed along, among the slaves. And it's just powerful because, and I talk about this a little bit in the presentation, but, you see, in a sense, like theology and just these values and ideas being passed around through folk tales and through songs. And, one of those values is that God was on the side of the oppressed and that he was on the side of those who needed to be liberated from this evil slave institution. So, so I didn't get a chance to get into the folk tales too much, but I'm gonna share a little bit here about, what I said in regards to the slave songs. This is definitely an important point, because thus far I've provided quotations from former slaves talking about practicing Christianity in their own way, using it as a means of personal or public resistance and so on. And, a lot of people might say, oh, well, maybe they were just, exceptions to the rule or something like that. Now, we have to understand that, the West Africans who were enslaved were coming from cultures that emphasize oral traditions and passing along culture through song and folk tales and so forth. Now, what we see among the African slaves here in the West is a continuation of that means of passing down the ideas, morals, and beliefs that were prevalent among them. African theologian John Mbiti talks about how in the African context, theology is passed down through songs and sayings, so to speak. So now, as Lawrence Levine points out in his essay, Slave Songs and Slave Consciousness, when we look at the songs, the slaves sang, they took God and different figures from the Bible, i.e., Daniel, Moses, Joseph, and they applied biblical stories to themselves in terms of deliverance from oppression in this world, triumphing over the powers that be, the payoff of perseverance, justice, and hope for the future. Now, there's no doubt that slave-holding Christians tried to instill ideas that slaves were supposed to remain as they were, just in that miserable condition. But clearly, this idea didn't take hold entirely, because through the lyrics of these slave songs, we see that a prevalent theme among the Africans was that the God of the Bible was on their side, on the side of the Africans, and would bring justice and set them free, whether in this life or the next. Now, once again, there's no excuses to be made for the Christians who participated in enslaving Africans, none whatsoever. But what I want to do here for a second is I want to just kind of shift gears a little bit and take these 5 points and really put them together so hopefully we can see a clear picture of what I'm getting at. When we think about it, if all we know about Christianity during the slavery era is basically an abusive relationship between the African slaves and slave masters who claim to be Christians, then it would be understandable that we would look upon that history and say, well, there's nothing for me there. There's nothing for me to connect to, right? However, as we increase our knowledge and scope of our ancestors' experiences and adding more historical pieces to our puzzle, getting a clearer view of what was going on back then, we're able to broaden our lens in such a way that we are not locked into assessing that period of history based on the Kunta Kinte slave religion scenario alone. All of a sudden, based on the historical evidence, we're not forced to define Christianity based upon that false, hypocritical slave master perversion of it. but rather we see slave masters refusing to allow slaves to hear about Christianity for fear that they would lose their so-called property, or that slaves would get uppity and see themselves as equal to whites. We see our ancestors risking their safety to practice Christianity independently and on their own terms, using Christianity as a basis for personal and public resistance, maintaining hope in a God of liberty and justice who sustained their sense of personhood in the midst of an evil slave institution. Now, I want you to think about it, okay? When we bring these puzzle pieces all together, these facts of history, and we bring these into the picture, suddenly we have a broader view by which we can affirm Christianity as represented among the slaves who survived and stood against slavery. We have a more complete picture by which I can make a more historically responsible, evidence-based assessment of the dynamic between Christianity and the African slaves. And with that, we find ourselves with connecting points. Connecting points with the true Christianity that so many of our ancestors latched onto in spite of the hypocritical religious institutions that were, quite frankly, on the wrong side of history. And that's really what I wanted, people to kind of get during that presentation, is that, that one Kunta Kinte scenario is not the full story. It doesn't account for the entirety of how African slaves came to Christianity. As a matter of fact, it certainly doesn't account for the ones who, were in, freed states or freed colonies or whatever. It certainly doesn't. Now, of course, I recognize that, it's inevitable, man. People will say, basically, the slaves didn't know any better. They were just so mentally beat down and oppressed that they, bought into the slave master's religion, just kind of hook, line, and sinker. Now, I'm not saying that, there weren't a number of slaves who were bamboozled, by the perverse version of Christianity pushed by the slave masters. But, just taking that broad brush, kind of blanket cookie cutter assessment of what Christianity was to the slaves as a whole, honestly, it's just, for the uninformed person, I guess at very least it's an injustice to our ancestors and really just undermines their dignity. And for anybody who has studied this stuff that I'm talking about, it's just dishonest, to paint that kind of a picture as being the only means by which Africans interacted with slavery. That's just false, man. We're talking about a people who, let's just be real. They survived one of the most heinous ordeals of human history. Real talk. But if you look at the years immediately following the Civil War, you see that within about a generation, Africans reduced illiteracy among them by about 50%. Just within about maybe a little bit over a generation, it took them to do that. Within 10 years of the Civil War. And then you have thousands of African American elected officials, including some who had positions in U.S. Congress. You have Africans, starting businesses and making their way into the workforce. Man, these were strong people. One thing I say to folks is, if you want to reject Chrys, just for your own reasons, then so be it. But our forefathers and mothers weren't so mentally impoverished that we can't grant them the dignity of their own spirituality and choosing Christianity. And I think really what's going on here is that, when people are just resistant to this idea that just maybe, some slaves and, Africans during that era came to know Christ on their own terms, they're just kind of resistant to that idea, is because they really want to use our ancestors as a crutch for their own unbelief. That's really what it comes down to. If you have Africans who are enduring, this slavery that folks are so upset about, and rightfully so. But, if you have Africans who endured it coming to Christ in a very true and real way, being able to see the truth of the gospel in spite of the evil slave institution, that they were faced with, then that really just kind of takes away the excuses from those who are living today who never picked a bit of cotton a day in their lives, but want to use, Christianity during the slave era as an excuse to not follow God. I think that's really what it comes down to, Now, of course, this presentation, or this portion of the presentation leaves a lot of questions unanswered, so you got to, of course, listen to the whole thing to kind of get some of the other pieces that I threw in there. Again, we talk about the genetic fallacy, and like I said, I also had a portion that I had prepared, where we talk about slavery in the Bible and morality and stuff like that. And so, so what I'm going to do, I'm basically just going to kind of take that aspect of the presentation and just, make that another podcast episode for you guys. But yeah, man, I'm just going to kind of leave y'all with that, man. I mean, it's just for me, it's just been an interesting journey, man. Over the last couple of years, there's just so much history that I was unaware of, and the more I just continue to study this subject, the more I realize how just silly it is that Christianity is the white man's religion. I mean, that's just a position that, I'm sorry, it just doesn't. Well, no, I'm not really sorry, but it's just a position that doesn't stand up to scrutiny when you take into account the historical evidence that's available, as well as philosophical reasons to reject that claim. So yeah, man, I'm just gonna leave y'all with that right there. Hopefully y'all enjoy that section of the presentation. Like I said, click on the link, man, the Talk with the Titans interview to check out the entirety of the presentation and the parts of it. I guess the outtakes, so to speak. I'll be making episodes out of that, dealing with slavery in the Bible and things of that nature. And but yeah, in the meantime, man, as promised, definitely want to leave you guys with my man Chrys Jones, Chrys, Chrys Jones, who's a gospel rapper, and he's got a song where he talks about his testimony in regards to the Hebrew Israelite movement. It's entitled Black Angels. So that's another episode in the books. Love y'all, man. Peace.
Black angels trying to bring us down. Stop listening, though you hear the sound. By the law, they say we earn our crowns, but even if we tried, we couldn't turn our curse around. I'm willing to pay the price for these rhymes like Bob Barker, and I gotta get it right, cause these times is much darker. There's too many people caught up in the web like Peter Parker. They're claiming to make the cut, but lower the taper like a barber. When I log on YouTube, I'm seeing a dismal sight. Bunch of black American men calling themselves Israelites. Their lies are pretty clear, but they disguise it using Hebrew, but despise the truth that has been made clear way back in Hebrews. And speaking of the new covenant, the old is obsolete. So going back to the old one says the new is not complete, but the first one is growing old like a man who's soon deceased. When you're dead in sin and slave by law, you will fail to be released till you put your faith in Christ, the great high priest, in his majesty, who gave his life as sheep to pay the fee and did it happily. For the law being weakened by the flesh could never be kept, so the righteous requirement by Jesus Christ had to be met. Black angels trying to bring us down. Stop listening, though you hear the sound. By the law, they say we earn our crowns, but even if we tried, we couldn't turn our curse around. The issue at hand deals with the nature of our sonship. Who can truly be saved? What races get the son's gifts? It's not enough for them to say that Christ can truly save a man. Like the Pharisees, they bank their hope in Father Abraham. In the flesh, they claim to be descendants of Sarah's seed, but they fail to see that Abraham was righteous through belief. Through deceit, they twist up the scriptures like Keith from LSG. That's liquid clear deception on display like LCD TVs. Know then the sons of Abraham are those who have faith, knowing that the Gentiles would be justified the same way. In Abraham, all the nations would receive blessedness. So then everyone who has faith in Christ will be blessed with him. For this reason, I put my heart into this verse. These black angels teach another gospel, let them be accursed. For this reason, I put my heart into this verse. These black angels teach another gospel, let them be accursed. Black angels trying to bring us down. Stop listening, though you hear the sound. By the law, they say we earn our crowns, but even if we tried, we couldn't turn our curse around. I have this deep pain in my heart, cause I know some people in this who've been trained to depart. It all began because of isolation and the notion that we do not need the local congregation just to make it. That leads to dangerous, unbiblical interpretation, which then leads to a little leaven that don't sound like Satan. Then you're reading books and blogs with that new theology and trying to spread the message, not listening to apology. I'm begging you, come home, please. Repent and return to Jesus Christ, just believe. I'm begging you, come home, please. Return to Jesus Christ, repent and just believe.
Look at what God's word says, not what men say about it. Use the King James Version as long as you can understand it, or any modern translation you might be able to understand better that's done properly. I'm not talking about cultic translations like the Jehovah's Witnesses, but read the Word of God. let it minister to you, and you will see that the gospel is for every person who will turn to Jesus Christ in repentance and faith, no matter who they are, no matter how many sins they have. Jesus is more powerful than any of us are evil sinners. He can bear that sin. He did upon the tree of Calvary. The gospel is for all races, all men. That's the Christian message, always has been, always will be. The gospel is for everyone, every single person. And if you're in Hebrew Israelism and you're struggling under this law and this having to fulfill these things, you'll never make it. The law was never intended to save us. It was intended to show us our sin and to point us away from ourselves to the sin bearer, Jesus, the Messiah.